part one of a reading on white fragility based on a book by Robin DiAngelo. And that last week was pure exposition with no critical comments. Today will be the criticism, and hopefully it will take just about 3 minutes, and I will attempt to share screen. Okay, what I'm going to do is read this. It's a reading, and I will be scrolling through it so that if you choose to do this, you can follow it on your phone, iPad, or computer. So here goes. Robin DiAngelo, in her book White Fragility, claims that white people are socialized to see themselves as individuals. She says that individualism obscures the systemic racism in our society. White people are incapable of seeing how they reinforce white supremacy with virtually every word they say or do not say. So if you remain silent in a racial dialogue because you want to listen, or because you're shy, or because you prefer one-on-one interactions, then you are complicit in preserving white supremacy. Now, if you find yourself objecting to this, then you are exhibiting white fragility, which triggers such moves as anger, argumentation, silence, and leaving the room. These behaviors reinstate white racial equilibrium. Now, this is what DiAngelo claims. From this, we see that white fragility theory is like a Kafka trap. This is named after Franz Kafka, who wrote a novel called The Trial, and that novel exhibits what that involves. The Kafka trap is a criticism of a theory is that when the criticism of a theory is interpreted as reinforcing that very theory. In this case, if you object to an insinuation that you are racist because you have white privilege, or that what you say has racist connotations, then you are failing to come to terms with your own racism. And of course, you are exhibiting white fragility. Now, there's a criticism that's been put forth by the linguist John McWhorter that compares anti-racism with religion. According to McWhorter, having been born white is like having been born with original sin. To take care of original sin, you go see a priest and get baptized. And then you have to go to confession for the rest of your life. Likewise, whiteness is a stain on your soul. And to take care of that, you need to attend anti-racism workshops for the rest of your life. This leads to the question, what is our vision of progress when it comes to white supremacy? Clearly, something needs to be done. We have a problem. Matt Taibbi, he's been writing for the Rolling Stone for some time. Taibbi raises this very question about progress. He says, for corporate America, the calculation is simple. What's easier, to give up business models based on war and slave labor, or to bench Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben? Taibbi claims that according to DiAngelo, when all is said and done, racism cannot be eradicated. It can only be managed through lifelong vigilance.
Jeffrey Proulx, who spoke to us in 2018 on mindfulness and the aging brain, is a professor at the Mindfulness Center at Brown University and also holds appointments at the School of Public Health and, interestingly enough, the School of Music at Brown.
Wow.
He earned his Ph.D. from Oregon State University with a focus on human development and completed postdoctoral work at OHSU in the Department of Neurology. He still has a position and a major research project at OHSU, thus working on both sides of the country simultaneously. Remember when you thought you were busy? Jeff's primary research is funded by the National Institute of Health and explores the effects of stress on physical and, by extension, mental health. When asked if that practice had any application to national and/or global consciousness in circumstances such as the current pandemic, he was quick to respond. His presentation will consider individual mindfulness as a coping process and as part of a global consciousness that promotes peace, compassion, and noble silence in response to the disruption, hate, and noise so common in this age. We welcome Dr. Jeffrey Proulx.
So, hello, Portland. I just wanted to do that. I always see these people that travel around in bands or giving talks or lectures or whatever, and they go city to city and they get to come up on stage and say, hello, Austin, or hello, Portland. So I guess that's me. So my name's Jeff Proulx, and as mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at the Mindfulness Center at Brown University, which is housed in the Department of Public Health at Brown, and I'm also in the Department of Psychiatry at Brown University. My research, and the reason why I'm in these particular places, because actually the funny thing is I'm either a physician or a public health person. I'm a psychologist by training. But what my research tends to do is to look at particularly health disparities in the United States and how these health disparities in communities like African American communities or Native American communities have come about, and how much of that is tied to stress. Because the diseases that I look at in health disparities in these communities, diabetes, Alzheimer's and dementias, immune system dysfunction, all of these things are tied into a lifelong process of having to deal with stressors that other communities haven't had to deal with. And so these tend to accumulate over the life course and start to contribute to these different diseases. So my approach has been to look at how can we use traditional practices in these communities and implement them into mindfulness programs in a way that people can use their own culture as a way of finding coping mechanisms within those cultures to address stress in their lives. And so my particular research right now is looking at a diabetes intervention in Native American communities in Northern California and Southern Oregon, which places me on the West Coast now. I'm in Portland, actually, of all places. But what my goal for that has been is to be able to look at how can we, so when you think about, or when I think about, and a lot of researchers think about stress and despair in underserved populations, a lot of that isn't just about the day-to-day stressors that people face. A lot of that is having to deal with the historical and cultural traumas that, and I'll use Native Americans as an example. I'm Native American, and Native people have had to drag around with them as a society the cultural trauma of genocide and of the loss of culture and the loss of language. And 90% of the population that was here when Columbus arrived is no longer here. You know, and so this is the stuff that Native people deal with, and any stress that they deal with is compounded by that historical trauma, with that pressure. It's something that people carry with them. And so when I think about how do we deal with larger cultural issues, a lot of that is how can we bring in these cultural traditions within our own person to embody those traditions. And so that's the crux of my research. Is mindfulness is a practice that allows us to come to our deepest, truest selves, right? You know, and the idea of mindfulness is to let go of the pressures of outside influences and of habits that we've developed over time, and to be able to let those go and to settle into the stillness of what is this present moment, the quietness of this present moment, the reality of this present moment, and letting go of all of the other pressures that we allow to build up in our psyche over time, and even if that's for 20 minutes or so. And I think I came to this, and I just wanted to think about, you know, when I was asked to give this talk, you know, we think about mindfulness as very much a very personal practice, something that we do for ourselves, that we take time for ourselves to do, which is true. But I think of Thich Nhat Hanh, who I don't know if many of you are familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh, but he's a famous meditation teacher from Vietnam, and he once said that, in speaking of social activism, he said that he doesn't practice meditation. He goes on retreat, and I'll go back on this as I've studied a lot of Buddhism in the past, and in Buddhism, it's a strong tradition for people to go and isolate, to go into silent retreat, and to do their meditation practice for long periods of time, which means to be isolated from the world around you. And he was talking about that practice of retreat, and he said a lot of people go on retreat as a means to escape, as a means to escape the world. And he said, but he does retreat the opposite. He does retreat so he can be better in the world, right? And so when I think about meditation, and what I'd like you to think about as a context of this is thinking of meditation isn't so much about just how we can affect the world, but how can we be better in the world, right? With that specific focus of improving ourselves and of getting deeper into our own understanding, so that way we can have a naturally better influence on the world around us. And I came to this, and I'd heard about this before, but when I was younger, I was very active in the in a movement to stop the production and testing of nuclear weapons in the United States, and that put me in a lot of very emotionally hot situations with sometimes people doing direct activism in places like the Nevada test site or Rocky Flats nuclear, where they used to make the plutonium triggers. And a lot of times there would be arrests and civil disobedience and just a lot of, and at the time, you know, there was this huge conflict between people who felt, especially in Colorado or Nevada, people who felt that these weapons and that everything around them was something that was to be really proud of. And more importantly, is that people felt a sense of pride and that they got a paycheck from contributing to America and America's defense. And it brought up a lot of huge emotions between people. And the impact was very real and led to violence and to, you know, heavy duty arrest. So, and I'd be in the middle of all that. And I remember that there was always a contingent of Buddhist priests that would be sent, that would go to these different events that were from Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And essentially they would be there, but they wouldn't be in the midst of the melee of people getting arrested and yelling and screaming at each other. You would just see them off to the side, sitting with a little drum and just beating to the heartbeat of the world, essentially. And I remember they would just sit with perfect posture in this perfect stillness and just be beating the drum. And I don't think anything was more, got through more in that setting than those people sitting in stillness and just representing that heartbeat of the drum. Everybody kind of kept being brought back to that. So what I'd like to do is just, if you'll join me, is to give people a little taste of what I'm talking about when I think of meditation and just settling. Because a lot of times if I give a talk like this, I'll ask people to look at the person next to them and to just make a contact with somebody, you know, and to recognize that I see you, you know, when you see me, and there's that connection, and that human connection, it leads us to a place where we don't want to be in conflict, you know? And so when we're separate from that, I think that makes people very uneasy and unnerved. And so what I think to do in any kind of situation where things get so much upheaval and so much confusion and a sense of not knowing, right? I don't know where this is going to go. That leads to just a tremendous amount of pressure on us. And so just to come back and to settle into that heartbeat, right? And anytime that we feel that tension and things arising, it's just such a precious resource and place to go, just to come to our own sense of our own rhythm in this moment. So if you'll join me, I'd just like to invite you to do a short meditation session with me. And a lot of meditation and a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is all circles around this idea of our posture. What is the posture that we present to the world in front of us? What is our posture right in this moment? And so what I encourage you to do is to get in your chair, if you're sitting or if you're standing, to stand nice and straight and tall. And in your chair, have your back nice and straight, not stiff, but nice and straight, so that way your spine and your neck and your head are all nicely aligned in one straight line. Your heart and your chest is out and open to the world in front of you, with your shoulders dropping down and relaxing like it was a coat on a hanger. and allowing your shoulder blades to drop down your back and rest, relaxing in your legs so that your legs are heavy and only being held up by either the floor or your chair. And just forgetting about any sense of meditation or meditating, letting go of any concepts, and just feeling your body sitting here in this moment, breathing, awake. And perhaps if you sit without any sense of going anywhere or coming from anywhere or anything to do, just sitting here and not attaching to any thoughts or any particular emotions or feelings, that those emotions and feelings on their own just start to liberate. Relaxing in your forehead and your eyes. Definitely relaxing your earlobes. And as your awareness settles, when your mind settles and your awareness actually becomes clearer, you may notice sounds. And allowing that awareness to be attuned to hearing. It is a critical point. Knowing that hearing is easiest done when you're not trying to hear. Noticing sounds from inside the room and outside the room. Sounds below you and above you. Without making up any narrative about the sounds. No stories. Not liking one sound over another or expecting a sound. Just simply sitting in stillness. Allowing sounds to come to you and go in an instant. And perhaps you may have noticed or experienced all of the textures of sounds, layers of sound, the energy of sound. But as you relax deeper, I encourage you to become more aware of the silences between sounds. The silence that serves as the backdrop of all sounds. And experiencing, if you can, that layering and texturing of sound within that silence. And I'd like to take a moment if anybody wants to comment on anything or have any questions or about the meditation. This is a good time.
Jeffrey, this is Helen. I just found that so relaxing, and the idea of silence and not having value to a sound, that was lovely. And I think it's something I could continue. I mean, it was going through my mind, you could do this. I could do this and just listen. Thank you. That was lovely.
You're welcome. And I think ultimately, coming down to when we think about mindfulness and I think about a presentation like this and a discussion, first of all, this is a discussion. The biggest thing about this is none of us know where any of this is going. I'm an academic. I'm on the West Coast. I don't know if I'll be teaching in the fall. I don't know, if I should move back to Providence or if I should just get a hotel room in Newport, Oregon, and just teach classes from there. I mean, we just don't know, what's going to go on. And given all that, so back to regular psychology and science, one of the biggest stressors that if we want to study and make predictions about is people who have a sense of not having control and not knowing what's going to happen. That's a tremendous stressor. And it leads to a lot of rumination, and it leads to worry, and it leads to kind of repetitive thought. And all of these things we know are lead to a sense of poor well-being, if nothing else. If not, in the long run, could have an effect on our health. So when we talk about stress, I look at stress as being, the classic responses to stress are fight or flight, and fight or flight or freeze. And that's because when we're faced with an event in our environment, our body wants to prepare us to be able to manage that threat. So let's say it's and so the experiences that we have, the feelings that we have are adaptive, they're evolutionary, they've helped us to survive. But what they were designed to do was to help us survive a saber-toothed tiger. If we were to come across a saber-toothed tiger, or to know that there was a saber-toothed tiger in a tree, our body will will send a message to our endocrine system to increase our heart rate, to flow blood to our muscles, our striated muscles, so we can run or we can fight. It also sends messages to our body to produce cortisol. Cortisol is the stress hormone. And cortisol, when it fills our body, it increases our energy stores. It shuts down the immune system. It does a number of different things that, moderates the immune system to be able to help us deal with these issues, but also then goes to the brain and gets affected by the hippocampus, makes a decision on how much cortisol you have in your body. And if there's enough cortisol in your body, the brain reads it, there's enough level, just like a toilet might, with a plunger. It says, okay, you have enough cortisol. It shuts down the process of making cortisol. The problem is that these are great if we have a saber-toothed tiger to have to deal with. The amount, if you were to measure it, the amount of sort of go time your body's on is pretty intense, what your body's doing to get ready. And that's great for a saber-toothed tiger. The only thing is that we as human beings, as we start to put on the same processes on newspaper stories, on letters from the IRS, on things that we see around us, we have that same response as if we have a saber-toothed tiger in our midst. And so the big question is that necessary, especially because if you keep hitting that system, all of those systems that I was talking about, the immune system, the heart, the brain, these are all very delicate systems. And if you keep doing that over time, as you start to wear and tear on these systems and they start to break down, which leads to poor immune system function. It leads to brain disrepair, especially around the hippocampus where our memories are all stored, and all of the different cells that are involved in that get to, are basically fried over time. And so the big question is then it gets down to this whole, this idea of perception. What is it that we're actually seeing? If I see a rope in the road, and every time I see that as a snake, my body's going to respond with all of those chemical reactions that I talked about before. But it's not a snake, and it doesn't matter to me, because if I see everything as a snake, I'm going to keep responding to it that way. So it always comes back to what is our perception? What are we really seeing in this moment? And how are we really responding? Slowing down the process of making adjustments and assessments about the world around us before we take action. Remember how I was saying, and you pointed this out, it's saying that, don't put a story on the sounds that you hear. And the reason why I say that is because everything that we have that comes into our environment, we want to categorize really immediately. Our brain just does this. And then once again, that's adaptive. It helps us to be able to process. We have millions of bits of information coming into our system all the time, whether it's our skin or our taste or our thoughts or our ears, just constant information coming in. And so the brain can't process all that, and it has to be able to really quickly bin stuff to what's important and what's not important. And so what happens is then, and if we have habits of binning things already into ways that we already think things exist, then we don't have the time to slow things down. And what mindfulness does is it gives us that opportunity to slow it down, right? To wait for that moment of being able to recognize that there's something in our environment before we react to it, and to quickly say, what is this that we're doing? And this is all just about, the same thing goes with the media, our friendships. There's a classic exercise I have people do in my mindfulness class, and I have them take a raisin and put it in their hand, and I say, okay, we're going to eat this raisin, but before we do it, I want you to look at it and tell me what you see, right? And a lot of people say, oh, I see a raisin. It's like, no, there's nothing that says raisin there, right? What do you see? People say, oh, I see a wrinkly little thing and I see pieces of sugar on it, right? We slow that down. What do you actually see, you know? And then I ask people to smell it and tell me what they smell. And people go through the, you know, it smells like dirt, or it smells like, you know, this or that. And then taste it and what goes on in your mouth. And people will say, oh my goodness, I'm just salivating, you know? And so when we slow it down, we see all of these different things that we never did. And usually what I ask people to do is to practice that mindful eating in every way that they eat food. And then they consider, you know, because the thing is, when we eat raisins, we tend to put them all in our hands and just, you know, just like grab them whole. We don't even look at it, right? We just take it and eat it, take it and eat it. And we don't even experience the process of doing that. And I ask people to say, what else do you do in your life that you basically do it that way? Media. Are you taking the time to smell that media? Are you taking the time to look at it? What are you actually looking at? Right? Is it because it's New York Times or it's Fox News? Have you already decided what it's going to be? You know, and so when we have mindfulness practice, we say step back, slow down, and try to just to see the bigger picture, to see that that larger issue.
One was a comment from Vale Humble, and he said, why is it called mindfulness and not mindlessness? Just why is it mindfulness rather than mindlessness?
Well, when we, that's funny because actually they call it, it's just, I think it's just tradition at this point. But when we think of mindlessness, it's actually the opposite of what you're considering. So mindlessness is how Ellen Langer puts it, is kind of our, and this is probably, I think this is semantics. I think this is the opposite of what you were saying. But I just wanted to say mindlessness, the way she says is that's our comment, that's our go-to place. That mindlessness is our sort of sense of autopilot. And like we've developed enough skills that we don't even really have to think about tying our shoe, right? We just do it. And so there's a lot about life that we do that we already know the skill sets, and we just sort of set ourselves off in a direction, and then we just sort of do things without even paying attention to it. It allows ourselves to just go into our fantasy world in our mind and live in that movie that we have, rather than being in the world that we're actually in. And I usually, a good example of this is I like to point out, you know, think about driving down the road on I-5, and for 5 miles, there's a lot of times I couldn't tell you the numbers of cars I passed, the colors of the cars, the billboards I saw, how many people were getting off at the Terwilliger exit. I couldn't tell you anything because my mind has been so caught up. And meanwhile, I'm driving in a 1,000-pound piece of steel and glass, 65 miles an hour, you know, within a car distance of people around me in either direction doing the same thing. And I can guarantee you probably everybody in there, in that group, is off in some other place, right? And they couldn't tell you. That's mindlessness. That's how we think about it. And I encourage people to think about in your day-to-day stuff is like, how often do you just get involved in a project, and once you get going and you know enough about what sort of like where you're going, then you just say, okay, that's good enough. Shut it off and go back to that, repeating the same argument you've had 85,000 times, or repeating that same, you know, conversation you've had 85,000 times. You just get back into that same thing again. Whereas mindfulness is to let go of that, right? Mindfulness is to become fully engaged in what it is that you're doing, fully engaged with driving, feeling the steering wheel, feeling your feet on the pedal, feeling the air come by. And the idea is that those are almost two different lifestyles, right? They're almost two different people leading two different lives. One caught up in sort of this kind of low-end trauma all the time, right? And the other one just kind of caught up in, you know, being in Portland, Oregon. I live in Providence, Rhode Island, and work at a really difficult place to work just because it's so high pressure. I'm going to tell you one thing: Portland, Oregon is the best city in the world. So anytime you wake up in Portland, Oregon, and you find yourself like on, oh, I'm not very happy. It's like, just, you live in Portland, Oregon. So you just call someone in Boston and say, oh, I'm sad. They're like, yeah, okay. You live in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah. I've got another comment from David Gray. I'll say it. Well, here's the question: is the sound during the meditation, the sound I heard from within was music. The sounds I heard were from within, he said. It was music.
Huh.
And I know David is very musical. I do know that about him.
Uh-huh.
And he just,
Very
that
cool.
was a comment that he made.
And that's the thing is like, you know, how often do we get to hear our own sound? You know, where it's so drowned out by everything else. And this is just an opportunity just to hear our own sound, to allow ourselves to sing. And when we're quiet, it's funny because that sound just starts to come out, right? And and I think just like that Zen priest is that with that heartbeat, you know, once if you can hear under the cacophony of all that other noise, right? And what's underneath all that? Right? Where is that? And the thing about that is that whatever's underneath all that, whatever's within all that, that silence, it expands infinitely, you know. And this we know from physics. You know, I think the thing about meditation and Buddhism in particular, but Buddhism and physics are tending to kind of come closer and closer together with an understanding of like what is underlying all things, especially in atomic physics when you're looking at, you know, there's nothing between proton and electron. You know, there's just nothing. You know, there's not oxygen. It's not, you know, it's just nothingness. And so, and when you think about the space between, you know, apparently the space between an electron and the proton and neutron in the nucleus is much bigger than it is from the sun to the planet Earth, right? If you were to put it in compare the sizes with each other. And so when you think about it, most of our entire physical world is empty of anything, you know, and so are all the sounds that we hear. So what is that that's underlying all that? And that's where I encourage people to kind of allow themselves to go to, because that's where our own sound is, you know, and so we can't hear all that when we're caught up in the world around us, especially because I wanted to talk about some of these different ideas and so I wanted to bring this into thinking about, you know, when we think about larger things, yes, we want to bring our own stress levels down because this is really, it is about us and we do need to be concerned about our own health and our own sense of well-being. But I want to go back to Thich Nhat Hanh and what he was saying about, you know, I don't do meditation that I can escape from these larger world issues. I do meditation so I can be better to address it. And I think that that's always been my attitude to take towards it. And I was bringing up a little bit about the stress reactivity thing. And so when we have these different ways of addressing stress is, you know, we can fight it. And so we have the endocrine and the muscle energy to be able to fight. We have the endocrine and muscle energy to be able to run as much as we can. That's what we're feeling when we feel the butterflies and we feel the tension in our arms and we feel a headache when we get stressed out. It's our body waiting to respond to that stressor. Now, there's another way. It's an interesting thing. And all of these things have been shown to be adaptive and why human beings and other creatures survive and pass on. There was an interesting thing. So thinking about evolutionary issues is that, so you had Og and you had Grog, right? Back in cave people days. And Og was a little bit more outgoing and had no fear. And Grog was a little bit more like us and had a little bit more put-offishness about going and doing things. So when they came across high grassy areas, Og would go right into the grass and say, hey, no big deal. And Grog would say, no, I'm not going in there. There could be snakes or tigers or anything. And of course, and the same thing with caves, and Og would go right into dark caves and Grog would say, no, I'm a little bit too scared to do that. And so what happened is over time, as Ogs of the world didn't survive and they didn't pass on their genes to the next generations, whereas the Grogs tended to survive and they passed their genes along. And so the New Yorker of all places actually said, maybe that's why we're all neurotic, is because it was that neurotic person that passed their genes on, right? And that's a survival tactic. So we got to remember that sense of apprehension sometimes maybe the thing, even though you may feel like really bad about it, it's the thing that got us to this point. But it also could be the thing that leads us to having a sense of worry and a sense of unease. So a number of years ago, a researcher had posited that another new thing, and this focuses more on women's biology than anything else. But men also can do this. It's not a difference between men and women, but originally it started, Shelley Taylor had originally started this idea of called tend and befriend, right? So you have fight or flight or freeze. But she said there was another thing that they noticed back in cave people days, is that oftentimes when the men were off fighting or flighting, the women were left with the children in certain circumstances. And what they needed to do to survive wasn't to fight or flight, it was to come together as a group, right? And to be able to work together as a group, to be able to survive whatever the issue was in front of them. And so what this is also driven by a hormone output, but it's oxytocin that it drives this particular one. So when you have cortisol and adrenaline pushing the other stress responses, oxytocin, which many of you may be familiar with, is called the love hormone. And it's what bonds us together. Oxytocin is that feeling you get when you're holding on to a puppy. You know, I mean, there's that burst of joy and love and connection that you have. And so what she was saying was that, and so instead of people having to have these rough, aggressive, terrible endocrine responses to their world, is how can you turn this into something that's tend and befriend, right? Being driven by love and compassion, and as opposed to fear and violence. And so that's one of the things I say, that mindfulness gives us that opportunity to think about tend and befriend, instead of having a reaction to the world around us, whatever's in the news, whatever's in the media, whatever's on social media. Instead of immediately reacting, is how can we slow that process down, right? And then be able to say, how can I tend to befriend this, right? How can I use oxytocin, love hormones, compassion, understanding as a way of being able to make that connection? And I think that's the main thing I encourage people to consider is as we move forward, is using meditation practices to do one thing, is to center ourselves, to constantly being able to center and hear what's actually in the world around us. And that centering, that posturing, right? How am I right in this moment? It's all about habits, man. I'm in health research, and it's all about what habits you have. And the same thing is just, it goes into our own sense of mental and physical well-being. Is what are our habits? And if our habits are coming towards bringing us to a peaceful place, more and more and more, bringing us to a place that we can hear more and more, that we can see things that we actually know to exist, and that we can do that with a sense of compassion, that we're, you know, I don't wear a mask so I can protect myself from coronavirus. I wear a mask so I can protect the rest of the community from coronavirus. And so when we do these practices, we're not doing them necessarily just so we can protect ourselves from the stress around us. We're doing these practices so that we can help protect the world around us. And so I would like to, before we move on to the question session, is do one more meditation practice, which does bring into more of a sense of compassion. And so I would like you to, I invite you to join me again in getting into a nice meditation posture. It's all about posture and being centered. Have a nice straight spine that's aligned with your neck and your head, with your heart out to the world, and your hands relaxed, and your feet on the ground. And I just want you to focus on your breath, the air coming in your nose. Noticing how your chest expands and your belly expands with each breath in, and how it contracts, allowing the air to just escape your body. Simple physics. A change of pressure on the outside or inside of your lungs causes the air to come in or out. It's that simple. And yet all of this air brings in the nutrients that we need to survive. It takes away the garbage that we need to be able to survive. And now I'd like you to picture somebody who you care very deeply about, a grandchild or a very close pet, spouse. And then your deepest sense of calmness and sense of love and compassion for this person, just generate in your heart that compassion and that warmth and that caring. And with just each breath out from your heart, up through your lungs and throat and mouth, breathing that light towards that person. With the intention, with every breath out that you send that person the sense that they may be safe, that they may know love, that they may know compassion, and they may never know fear. Noticing how easy it is to generate that intention for this person. Knowing that this person can face pain and sorrow and worry, but that each breath you send out sends the intention that they never experience that ever again. Breathing out that intention, generating it deeper and deeper within yourself, that intention, and sending it to that person. Now I'd like you to picture somebody who you may have seen on the street or on a bus, some person you've never seen before and will never see again, just a neutral person. But coming to understand that they too experience worry and despair and sadness, existential. And maintaining that same level of compassion and love as you had for a person close to you, sending out with your breath the light and the intention that that person may be safe and free from suffering, even though you've never met them. And now picture somebody that you have very much difficulty with, someone that angers you or makes you very sad, but recognizing that they too also have to balance the existential sadness of sometimes being alive, and whatever pains or suffering they may experience may explain their difficulty. But either way, with the same intention that you had with somebody that you love very much, sending out that light from your heart to that person with the intention that they be safe and they may be free of suffering. Obviously, a little bit more difficult to send that intention, but doing it nonetheless. And now picturing yourself, knowing that you yourself sometimes face difficult times, confusion and sadness, worry. So from the depths of your heart, sending yourself that light of the intention to heal, to feel safe, to know joy, and to be free of suffering from this point on. And now if you can, imagine the person in the next room from you, in the next house, and all the houses on your block, and all the people in Portland, in Oregon, in the West Coast, in the United States, and around the world. Each one of us are facing that same dilemma in this moment. And so with the depths of your heart, sending out in all directions a light with the intention that all people may be safe. And then just allow your awareness to settle on your breath, following each breath as it comes in and each breath as it goes out. Simply knowing if you're breathing in or if you're breathing out. And continuing to breathe like this for about another minute until you hear the sound of the bell. And just gently opening your eyes and wiggling your fingers and toes. And I think we have a few minutes for some questions if people have any.
Jeff, if you want to, I can show the little 2-minute video that you had from here.
Sure.
Okay, I'll do that now.
You have volume?
No volume.
No, there's no volume.
No volume. Oh,
Just watch.
But the point is that when you're paying too close attention to one thing, they asked you to pay attention to how many times people pass the ball. And so when you're all focused in on that one little thing, is you can pay attention to that. But the main thing is what are you missing in the background? You know, so that's the other thing about these practices is that when we get so caught up and so focused in on details about certain things or about certain people, is that we start to miss the bigger picture. And so as much as we can is let go of the of getting too caught up into being myopic about too much and see as much as you can about the bigger picture and all of this. And I think that's where a lot of our worry and confusion comes from, is we get too caught up in the little games that are played around us and too caught up in the details, is that we miss the bigger picture. So
Yeah, I know the first time I saw something like that, I never saw the gorilla. This time I was like, I was ready, but I didn't see the black t-shirted players leave or the screen change. So that was interesting.
Well, that also goes to the same thing, is that you were already expecting, you already knew what was going to happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and so then you still miss stuff. And how much do we already know what we're looking at, and that we already know, or we think we know where to look for something, and we just miss the whole big picture.
It's the side thing.
You know, and always be wondering about that and stepping back. And it's like, am I getting too caught up into the minor details of things, and am I missing the bigger picture? How can I step back and to broaden my scope of awareness, to not be caught up in, you know, like I was saying, underneath all sound and everything that we have is this wide open nothingness, emptiness, right? You know, and so we're not even aware of that. We get caught up in the noise and the confusion. Is like, well, where can our minds be if we're actually settling into the bigger picture and into that stillness and awareness?
Jeffrey, there's a question. Al Christians has a question.
Oh, yes. You know, I heard in your introduction, you know, you do some music work, and you talked about the effects of stress on people. I'm using music during this pandemic period to forget about all the bad news and all the turmoil in the outside world, etc. You know, I sit down for a while every day and try to work on something that's challenging to me musically, because I don't have the skills of a musician, but I'm trying to develop some of them a little bit. It's hard, but it occupies my mind. Again, perhaps it's the myopia that you're just talking about, but it takes my mind off everything else. Are you saying that that's not a good way to address the problems, or to think about the problems of the world, or to try to relieve stress? Is that what does that practice need in order to be a good way to protect me from the damage of stress?
it doesn't need anything. You're doing absolutely the perfect thing. When you're doing music, you're not doing anything different than if you were focusing on your breath, or if you were focusing on hearing sounds, or if you were focusing on your thoughts. What you're doing is you're in that moment actually doing that thing, right? And so I talk to a lot of people about this. A lot of times I'll ask people, what do you do to relieve stress? And a lot of people will say, gardening, or playing music, or reading a book, or doing, riding a bike. Well, that's because when you're doing those things, is that you're not caught up in what's happening in the future or what's happening in the past. You're actually doing that thing, right? So when we wash dishes, is your mind somewhere else? When we're driving a car, is your mind somewhere else? But when you're doing in that, so we have a lot of activities that our brains can be, like I mentioned before, mindless, right? Where we're just on autopilot. But when you're playing music, or when you're playing tennis, or when you're with your dog, dogs are great for bringing you into the present moment because they're totally present all the time. And when you're with them, you're not thinking about things that are in the past or the future, you're just with them, right? And so that's what I encourage. And that is the best stress reduction, is to do what you're doing, right? Not to be play acting it and then with your mind somewhere else, where you're having a conversation, or you're creating a speech, or you're doing, you're reliving old vacations. When you're washing dishes, wash dishes. When you're playing saxophone, play saxophone. When you're walking, walk, right? And so, and be fully engaged in that activity. And what brings us stress is the discursive mind that's in other places. That's the stress, right? Because then and every time I go in my mind and I rethink an event that brought me a tremendous amount of physical discomfort, I relive this physical discomfort, not in my mind, in my body. It's happening again. Or if I think about something in the future that I'm really worried about, well, all the anticipatory stress hormones get going in my body for real, even though I'm just imagining it, right? And so every time we do that, we keep bringing up these physical responses to something that's imaginary, and so when we're playing music, we're not doing that, right? We're just doing that music, and we're not involved in that discursive thought that brings us that physiological reaction. So that just playing music in itself is going to change the world, because the more we engage in just doing what we're doing in that moment for the act of doing that, right? Not to get anywhere, not to be prettier, not to be richer, not to get our high school degree or whatever it may be, just to play music in that moment is the stress reduction of it. And if we can bring that to everything we do, then we start to notice that stress is reduced.
Now, do you disagree then with the music teachers who all say, well, you have to record yourself and listen to yourself if you're ever going to get any better? Would that be a stressful part of the process that I should throw out?
No, because that's you're getting into an idea of flow, right? So the ultimate goal of mindfulness, not the ultimate goal, but one of the key goals would be getting this concept of flow. And are you familiar with that in psychology?
Sure.
So flow, and the only thing to get to flow. So flow is this combination of taking expertise and being in the present moment and applying that to that moment, right? So they when you look at Eric Clapton, and he gets in the flow all the time because he's got this tremendous level of expertise, but when he's playing music, he's not thinking about Donald Trump. He's thinking about his chord progression, right? He's there, he's playing music, he's on stage, he's not somewhere else, he's not on the bus, he's not imagining to be somewhere else. But also what he's doing is he's trying to get better, right? So that's the key to all of these things, is you also have to have the intention that you're going to be a little better than you were the last time. And that's what drives flow, And so if you think about the bigger picture of it, taking these recordings, listening to yourself, well, that's always the process of increasing your skill set. So on the bigger picture, maybe in that moment it might be stressful, but once again, bigger picture. How does this fit into the bigger picture? Not getting caught up in the small details of things. And so that would fit really well into the whole flow process. Always trying to do a little bit better than you did last time, right? Not exceeding like far, far, far big goals, but just getting a little better each time you do it. And that brings you fully into that moment.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
I've got a comment from Joyce. A question: has quarantine helped some to find this back to the heartbeat?
Could I just add to that?
Oh, yes, please, Joyce.
I'm just wondering if other people have had the same experience, because it's caused me to slow down and get uninvolved in a lot of things outside. And that's been good in some ways, but it has also led to a kind of, I don't want to go back into that world. I'm not sure I want to just stay in this nice, cozy, comfortable place. And I don't know if that's healthy either.
You know, we're all going to have to see how this plays out. You know, this is a lot of, once again, getting into that sense of not knowing, you know, where it is that we're going to be and where we're going to land on all this. And I think the key is and what I try to do, this is just my own personal thing, is I often find myself in discomfortable situations. Just, it could be crossing the border and having to deal with Border Patrol people, you know, I mean, and that, it's not like a big, huge deal, but it just could be, boy, this could take up my whole day and who knows what's going to, you know. But my thing is, so when I'm sitting there and I'm kind of stewing in my own stress hormones when I'm in some of those circumstances, and I just try to turn around and say, hey, you know, if I can bring myself to sin, there's really nothing here to be that stressed about, right? There's no need to have this anxiety. But if I can find myself in any moment where I'm feeling that anxiety, if I can be happy in that moment, right? Because I always keep thinking, my thing is that whenever I'm unhappy, I think if I get somewhere else, I'll be happy, right? Or if I get something else, then I'll be happy. If I get to this place, then I'll be satisfied. So there's always this other place and this other time that I will be satisfied if I can get there. Well, that to me is backwards, because then I kind of keep going to place thinking, well, I'll be satisfied later. I'll be satisfied when I get this, you know, and as opposed to, and funny thing is that over time, if we look back on all the things that we, you know, I mean, I think about how many times, if I lived in Portland, Oregon, I mean, I would probably say, hey, I will never be stressed if I go to Portland, Oregon. But I bet you there'll be days if I move back here that I would be stressed out, and forgetting about that. I knew 10 years ago, if I moved to Portland, Oregon, I'd be all happy. The key is that it's never somewhere else. Is how can we get centered here in this moment? How can we become aware of, you know, the tension that we're in right now, and be able to calm our bodies in this moment, right? No matter what we're doing. And that takes intention, you know. So I think with time, a lot of us are starting to, you know, we're becoming more comfortable. We're just kind of going back to where we, you know, we weren't that busy 75 years ago, you know, and had to be out and doing all these other things. You know, we were all, I think this is a lot more like we were always, you know, before we had cars and cell phones and TVs, and we're just settling back into a whole, into kind of older ways of how we lived, you know, not always going all the time. And so I think the big key here isn't that, yes, this as an experiment, we may find ourselves being in these positions where we can be more isolated and be more comfortable with that. But I think there's got to be an intention, right? You have to know that this is what you're doing. Like I'm home now, and I'm going to start making home my meditation spot. And this is where I come to be still. And if I have to be still for an entire week, then I'll be still for an entire week. You know, it's just that stillness and cultivating it. Jeff, and not always thinking that later I will get satisfaction, but how can I achieve this now in this moment?
Jeffrey, there was a question from Willie. Does mindful eating help us lose weight?
Yes.
Okay.
Period.
Great. And David Pedworth had a question. Dave, can you unmute?
Yes. This clock has been in the family for over 145 years. It's part of my life. When I was a child, and every evening when that clock was wound, it was time to go to bed. No ifs, ands, or buts. And now I use it when I try to do a little relaxation response meditating. I start at 10 minutes before the hour, and then I know when it chimes for the hour that the meditation is over. But how should I deal with the ticking?
You just hear it.
Okay.
And don't respond to it. You know, I think that's the key I mean, that would be a great practice, you know, of just being able to hear without reacting to that sound, and see if you can just get to that point. And when you do react, you know, like find out where is it that you're reacting? How are you responding? Like, what is it? Do you feel it in your chest? Do you feel it? You get a little kind of like ticking in your ear, when every time it ticks, you like kind of feel something in your eardrum shake a little bit. What is it in your body that responds to the ticking? And just kind of get into that and just feel that without almost objectively, you know, like kind of separate yourself from the experience and just observe it and see what's going on. That would be a great exercise.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. We have a final question from Todd. Todd, do you have a question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff, for a helpful presentation. First of all, I want to compliment you on your Zoom background. You got a Space Odyssey 2001 thing going on there. And my question is, in my life experience, I've noticed that the more formally educated a person is, the more open they are to meditation. And I wanted to know if there's any research to back that up.
Yeah, that tends to be, and I think that's more of a correlation. We're not sure if that's like an actual relationship, like, because it's probably more likely that people who would be inclined to be meditators are also people who might be more inclined to pursue higher education. So I'm not sure that there's a, like one thing causes the other, but I think the two are kind of related to each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
And Nancy Pappas had just a final comment about the importance of appreciation. She wrote it in the chat for everyone to see. And I think that's certainly an important part of getting through stress, is just finding things to be appreciative for and recognizing the good things in our lives. Jeff, thank you for a really lovely presentation. It was the meditation. I just feel so good right now, and I think we all do.
Good.
The wonderful thing is, you know, this is it's been recorded, and so we'll be able to, in a few weeks when it gets posted to our website, the HGP website, we'll be able to do that meditation with you again, just by playing the recording. So thank you. Thank you.
Let me make one suggestion. If it is something that you're interested in, the University of California at San Diego, UCSD, if you type in UCSD mindfulness recordings, they have a whole wall of different types of mindfulness recordings that's free, and they encourage you to download it and keep it. But they've got body scans and yoga and sitting meditation and compassion meditation with lots of different types of teachers and lengths of time. So it gives you, if you want to explore more of this, you can go here and you get some good guided meditation.
Wonderful. Thank you.